you. Do you think there's anything wrong with my voice? You're right. Laryngitis. So if you'll bear with me, we'll see what happens. You know, many billions of years ago, before man existed on Earth, there were communities of various types that teemed with activity. And these were miniature cities. And inhabiting those cities, we find that there were the insects that we know as ants. Now, those communities, of course, were extremely old, and to give you an idea of just how old they were, I'd like to have you look at this piece of amber that I have in my hand. This is fossilized pitch, 23 million years old, and entombed inside of it is an ant of that same age. Now, this came originally from the Baltic area of Europe. This ant was entrapped in this pitch as it ran down the side of a tree. The pitch solidified, formed this amber, and today we have a very good scientific specimen in this material right here. Now, many of the animals that existed at the time that this ant lived are now extinct. Ants seem to go on forever. Now, to tell us about ants, we are privileged to have a man who's had considerable experience in the field of study of ants and is well qualified to tell us how ants live. Dr. Edward S. Ross, Curator of Entomology at the California Academy of Sciences. Welcome once again to Science in Action, Edward.
Well, I've developed a very keen respect and sense of wonder about ants, and for this reason, we who study ants are always a little perturbed at the general public reaction when we announce what we study.
Well, I think I probably know how it goes. They say, oh, you're studying ants? Well, come over to my house. I have lots of ants.
That's it, exactly. They either say that or mutter something about ants coming to picnics. It always seems a pity to me that ants aren't more universally recognized as interesting creatures to study instead of things to be despised and stepped on. I think it's safe to say that as a group, ants are perhaps the most marvelous creatures that exist.
You know, that's a rather strong statement. I'm just wondering how the housewife who has to fight ants occasionally feels about that.
Well, she should have a keen respect, too, because the very difficult battle she fights should prove my point and increase her respect for the ant. But I can sympathize with her problem, though, and I'll do my best to tell her how to control ants.
Well, before you do that, I'm wondering if perhaps we shouldn't look a little bit more at ants in general so that we'll have a better idea how these control measures actually work.
Although ants are very small in size, they actually are a very important part of the world about us. For one thing, there are more than 3,500 different kinds of ants in the world, and here's a museum drawer of specimens that'll show a few of them. I really became impressed by the number of ants in the world when I visited New Guinea in the war, and I collected around 10,000 specimens of them, representing about 200 species, of which 82 were new to science. The specialist in England that named these named one after Winston Churchill, this little ant here. And they even named one after Harry S. Truman.
Incidentally, Ed, I might point out that almost everything that one touches in the tropical forest has ants on it. What about the density of ants?
Well, the comparison is really staggering between the density of ant populations and humans. I know of one estimate that showed that a 10-acre plot in Maryland had between 11 and 13 million individual ants of just one species. That's about the number of people we have in the state of California. Now, if the individuals of all the species were counted in that 10-acre plot, I'm sure it would show that the ant population of this small acreage exceeds that of the human population of the United States.
Well, maybe the white man has been able to take the country away from the Indians, but I don't think he'll ever do that as far as the ants are concerned.
Well, that's just as well, because except when we invade the ants' home ground when we go out on picnics, few of these ants bother us. In fact, they play a very important role in the balance of nature and do a lot of good.
What is it about ants, Ed, that make them so successful?
Well, I think the greatest single thing is that they pass food from mouth to mouth. And here's two ants doing this very thing. One ant has found something to eat, and a hungry fellow worker is begging a meal, and it's being fed by regurgitation. By the same method, food is passed by the queen to her young.
Now we hear something about two different stomachs. What's the story on it?
Well, there's a lot of truth to the fact that ants have two stomachs. This diagram will show where they are. There's a long esophagus that runs through the head and the thorax and back into this abdomen here. And there's a swelling which uses a narrow constriction which functions like a valve, and a small amount of the food is allowed to trickle into the true or personal stomach here, and that's what nourishes the ant.
Well, what's the story on ants in relation to other insects feeding such as this?
Well, a lot of ants take a meal from the ants. They've learned that ants give off these sweet fluids, and here's a strange tropical mosquito that sticks its strange beak into the mouth of an ant, and it gets its meal in no other way. In fact, its beak is specially adapted just to get sweets from the mouths of ants.
How about the development of ants?
Well, it's a very interesting thing, a very nice story, because each year a colony produces a large number of winged males and females. Here are some females here. The male is much smaller and more slender in build. Under certain climatic conditions, it might be just after the first fall rains, hundreds of these suddenly swarm out of the nest and swarm into the air, forming a nuptial or marriage flight. Now, many fall prey to birds, bats, and other enemies while in flight, and others are eaten when they return to the ground. The males, in any event, soon die, and each mated female drops to the ground and gets rid of her wings as these are no longer needed. She does this by chewing or pulling them off with her jaws. Then she seeks a place to start a new colony of her own. Having found a hideout, the new queen closes the opening and waits for her eggs to develop. This may take weeks or even months. She takes no food during this time, but lives on stored fat in her body. First eggs are laid in a little cluster, and they later hatch as tiny whitish maggots. Here she's feeding some of them now. They are without eyes or legs, and they're completely dependent on their mother's care and feeding. She feeds them as best she can by passing droplets of her saliva into their tiny mouths, and strangely, the mother may even chew up some of her eggs and feed to her young. There isn't much food to go around, so the growth of the firstborn is stunted. They finally develop into tiny workers. Now, these are all females, but because they were undernourished, they will never be able to produce their own young, but work for the queen. Some leave the nest in search of food, and others start enlarging the nest. Here some are moving pupae around, little cocoons. They, of course, pass food from mouth to mouth, as we said, but this care works in two ways. The larvae secrete fluids that are highly attractive to the ant, and it is said that the real reason the workers take such good care of the babies is to protect and increase the supply of this delectable fluid. Now, when one of the food-filled workers returns to the nest, it can give some of the food to the babies, as you see here, putting it right in the mouth, or it can pass it on to the queen or to the other helpless, undeveloped larvae. See, that ant is probably getting some of that fluid I spoke of at this time.
Well, that certainly explains how poisonous ants are able to work.
Yes, if the workers go out and visit a jar of this poison, they bring some of it back to the colony where it's passed from mouth to mouth and it kills the whole colony. A very interesting experiment was conducted to show how rapidly food, poisoned or otherwise, can pass through a nest. 6 workers were fed honey that had been dyed red. And 24 hours later, all members of the colony had traces of this red dye in their stomach. Now, it all originated from these 6 individuals, and similar experiments have been conducted with radioisotopes. Now, if the poison had been placed in the honey, instead of the red dyes or isotopes, as is done in these little jars of syrup, the whole colony would be dead. One has to be very careful to follow the directions very closely on these bottles, and above all, don't put them around where children or pets can addition to these syrups, the latest thing on the market for controlling ants is chlordane. This material is available in hardware and garden supply stores, and all one has to do is follow the directions on the bottle. Interestingly enough, you don't have to hit the ants. All you have to do is spray the area that they frequent, and they're doomed. Now, let's get back to the story of a typical ant colony. As we've said, the ant colony is composed of a queen and the male and her workers. But in certain kinds, the workers get more food and they develop great big heads and become what we call soldiers. They have these big heads and mandibles. And these different kinds of workers, which are all females, take on different tasks in the colony, and this division of labor causes the ant colony to have a resemblance to that of a society of humans. We must keep in mind, though, that in all these single-queened ant colonies, all these workers are sisters of varying age. And they have no private life of their own, and they live for the welfare of the colony and this delectable fluid that I mentioned. Now, each year, a queen may produce hundreds of these workers, but the population of the nest is also increased by the hundreds that survive from previous years. Ants, by the way, are the longest-lived of insects. The workers may live 3 years, and the queens have been known to live 12 to 17 years. And all this time, except in the cold of the winter, the queen is like an egg-laying machine. Here we see the workers taking care of these babies. Now, there you can see some winged forms in there, and these winged forms, you might say, are products of prosperity in the colony. In other words, they're only produced when the supply of food is very abundant. Most of the time of the year, the food is barely enough to go around, and hence all the ants are undeveloped females, and they'll never develop their reproductive powers. When there's a surplus of food, you do have these winged forms. Actually, it takes a number of years for some colonies to be prosperous enough to afford the production of reproductive forms. Well, now that the males and females are produced in the colony, the cycle is complete. And as we've said, under the proper climatic conditions, these take flight and leave the nest. There are many exceptions to this cycle, but it'll serve as a basis for understanding the development of a typical ant colony. Now, ants have a tremendous variety of ways of living, and I'd like to tell you about a few. We only have time to hit a few highlights. Perhaps one of the most interesting things ants do is make these ant hills. This is actually a very small one. A really big one would be 8 feet tall and more than 50 years old, and would have perhaps a population of 200,000 individuals. The interesting thing about an ant hill is it's like an incubator for the babies. Babies are inside, and when the sun's rays hit this perpendicularly, the interior of the mound is warmer than the surrounding flat ground. And hence, it's more or less typical of cooler latitudes to find these, and higher altitudes, to have these ant hills. If we break an ant hill in half, we'll find that it's made up of a maze of little galleries, and the worker ants move the babies from place to place in these galleries to take advantage of the particular conditions they prefer. For example, if the weather is very warm, they may bring all their babies back to the interior of the colony and where it's cool. On a cold day, they'll bring them to the sunny side to get the benefit of the warmth.
What about silk spinners, Ed?
Well, there are many ants that make their nests away from the ground, and twigs and stems and under bark, and one of them spins silk. We don't usually think of ants as spinning silk, but there's one ant that picks up these larvae that we've just seen spinning the silk, and as the larvae thrash back and forth like this, they exude a strand of silk. And a whole team of workers will pull leaves together in this form, and then another team of workers will hold these silk-spinning larvae, and while they thrash back I was also in the tropics, the American tropics, I saw these strange leaf-cutting ants. They're often called parasol ants because they carry this bit of leaf above their head. They go up these trees and cut out the leaf, and then they walk down carrying it. You'll see long trails of these leaf-cutting ants. And they have a better use for the leaf than just making parasols out of them. They gather the leaves and bring them into underground chambers where they're piled up and form compost. And on this rotting material, a special fungus grows. Fungus, see, here's the chamber going down into the depths of the soil, which they both take dirt out and go down in themselves with the leaves. And the compost, you see, is under the fungus. And this strange fungus, it looks like a sponge. It's found no place else in nature but in the nests of these particular ants. And when a queen goes out on her mating flight, she carries a little wad of the fungus in her mouth so that she'll have a little seed to start her own fungus garden when she gets there. Now, another interesting kind of tropical ant that you hear a lot about are these army ants. And these ants really don't nest. They make bivouacs. And here we see a bunch of them racing along a stem in the jungle. And they attack and eat all sorts of things in their path. They like animal life chiefly. And they carry their young with them, and they drag their queen along. She's unable to walk by herself. Now, there goes the queen right now. See, she's being dragged just like a royal procession there. One's usually afraid of these army ants, but they won't hurt you unless you just stand right in their path. I stood alongside them and they've gone about their business without paying any attention to me. Another interesting type of ant is the honey ant. In this kind, the certain individuals, we call them repletes, are filled with sweet liquids until they're stuffed just like a toy balloon. Here we have one, you see. It's really remarkable. This used to be a small abdomen, and these are very much like living storage bottles because whole groups of them that are filled up by the workers will cling to the top of the chambers, and during periods when there's no food outside, the workers can take a meal anytime they want from these living storage bottles right in on the roof of their gallery. I've had a lot of people ask me how to keep an ant colony, and so I brought one along that I have at home. My whole family gets a lot of pleasure watching it. It's really a fascinating thing. I made this little colony out of plaster of Paris. I made a special mold that would cast 3 small rooms and a large room. And these happen to be carpenter ants that like to eat a sliced apple I have here in the center. And I keep a little moist tissue paper to keep up the humidity. And you notice I've cut little doors that go from room to room, and the ants move their babies around to wherever the conditions suit them best. I've made the piece of glass on the large room separate from those on the small so that I can take care of them without disturbing the whole nest. I can slip in food. Now, if one were to want to start a colony of ants, he'd go out into the field and look under stones and try and find one of these large native kinds. Here's some more of these carpenter ants. I'll show you what happens when they're on the loose. I put a little tanglefoot around here trying to keep them on the table, but see, they're busy trying to get away from the light. Ants bite and sting at the same time, although they're not really very poisonous. And see, I'm not afraid to they won't, Larry bites me, see, takes a little nip on me. Doesn't hurt, it's rather blunt. But just like anybody else, I don't like to have ants crawling all over me. Well, that's about the story of ants. You can see that they do a lot of strange things. They spin silk, they grow fungus and so forth, and I hope a lot of you will want to have an artificial ant colony after this story. Now, Mr. I guess you see that Dr. Harold's voice did give out, but nevertheless, we're going to introduce our two guests for the night who are knocking over their names, Petunia and Taboo. Very appropriate names for two little spotted skunks. And our guest tonight, the keeper of these skunks, is Dr. Benson of the University of California. And Mrs. Benson is holding the other member of the family. Dr. Benson, where did you get these skunks?
Well, the first skunk came from Inverness, from a neighbor's place, and the other we accumulated from a friend of ours who decided that he didn't want to keep a skunk anymore in order to have a
Well, I think the very first question I should ask you is, how is it that we aren't driven away by these skunks? Did you do anything to them?
Their offensive equipment has been removed.
Well, that's just fine. Oh, I see one of them is eating here. What are you feeding them?
Well, Petunia lives on horse meat, but Taboo lives on cooked food, lamb chops and so on, avocados, cheese, and honey.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really care much for the lights, but Petunia is always hungry, and we can keep him quiet.
There's always time to eat.
Sometimes he will stand up, but whether it's stand up Petunia, I think he's a little too
Well, do you
excited.
keep these around the house, or do you have them in a cage, or
Well,
how do you take care of
Taboo
skunks?
lives in the kitchen in a cage under the breakfast table, and she eats with us. But Petunia lives in the basement by himself.
Oh, don't they like each other, or how come they have
Well,
them separately?
The Taboo is the female, and she's hard to get along with,
I
and
see.
we have to keep them separated to protect
Mhm.
Petunia.
They'd actually hurt each other, I suppose, if they got together.
Well, she rules the roost.
I see. Well, they certainly look like they make very nice pets. And I guess you attract a lot of attention when you are seen with them in public, or are you seen with them in
Yes,
public?
most people say they've never seen one before, but they're common California mammals.
Well, this is quite different than the striped skunk, isn't it? This is, what do you call it, the California spotted
It's
skunk?
a spotted skunk. It wasn't the name for it.
The larger ones are, see there, now that shows what you're talking about.
Turn her up.
Are they very smart animals? They don't seem to have very big heads. Not much room for brains.
Well, they're really quite intelligent. At least he has learned to keep away from her.
I know
And,
she didn't pay any attention to his meat there. I guess that proves your point.
She doesn't like horse meat. Her meat has to be cooked. Go run her on her shoulder.